According to mainstream scholars, Western civilization owes most, if not all of its culture, to ancient Greece, generally, and more specifically, its music. This ideology runs concurrently with the refutation of any socio-cultural contribution from the Orient to the Western world. Sir John Hopkins, born in 1532 and died in 1595, a naval commander, naval administrator, privateer, slave trader, and administrator, wrote that the Oriental's best music is said to be hideous, with astonishing sounds. Of what importance can it be to inquire into a practice that has not its foundation in science or system, or to know what are the sounds that most delight a Hottentot, a wild American, or even a more refined Chinese? Later, Charles Burney, born in 1726 and died in 1814, in his General History of Music, simply ignored Chaldeans and other Orientals. Thus, while enlightening Western civilization's Hellenic socio-cultural fundamentals, anything Oriental became nefariously obfuscated, if not eliminated. But for Hopkins' culturally orientated salvation of the Hebrews away from the lesser Orientals, making their music perfect, alongside Greek excellence, although uncannily, nothing remains of the music in the Bible, implying that, regardless, it could only be perfect. However, there is a critical evidential obstacle since no autographic manuscripts about music theory have survived in support of Hellenic cultural antecedents, and thus, it is advanced that ancient Greek music theory eventually osmosed into later Latin manuscripts, thus emerging as copies of copies and copies of translations, some dating from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, but mostly from the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, and later. Some scholars have attempted at proving, through the complex meanderings of transmission mechanisms, that after all, copies of copies, and copies of translations, in the course of centuries, were the accurate accounts of elusive earliest autographic musical manuscripts from ancient Greece, and thus it has become common practice among Hellenists to date a manuscript, not from the date at which the copy was made, but from the date at which the original would have been written. A reputable American scholar, while supporting, on the one hand, the antiquity of Pythagoras's, Plato's, and others' music theories, that he says were written during the pre-Common Era, but on the other hand, questions the reason why this music theory survived for nearly 2 millennia, and whose merit it was that it survived. This strangely suggests that ancient Greek music theory was contemporaneous to the writing of the Christian Gospels, and not before. Now, patrology, or the science of Christian evidence, has been much more meticulously researched than Greek music theory, and regardless, has not indubitably proven any of the historicity of a certain Yeshua ben Yosef, also known as Jesus Christ, his life, his ministry, his death and resurrection, and that therefore it is axiomatic that the contemporaneous history of Greek music theory must be far less credible than that of Jesus. Another scholar goes on saying that Greek works of the first centuries of the Common Era are believable, and mentions, in support of his assertion, Aristoxenus's Rhythmica, first published in 1898 as Fragment 9 of the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, and adds that fragments 667 and 3706, dating from the 2nd and 3rd century of the Common Era, preserve, in characteristic Aristoxenian language, an analysis of conjunct and disjunct scales, and of genera. However, the document to which he refers is nothing more than a copy from the same source, and then no wonder he finds there similarity of the characteristic Aristoxenian language. However, Aristoxenus of Tarentum was born around 375 BCE, and some would have us believing that a span of 6 centuries between the Aristoxenian discourse and its later fragmentary copies would not have suffered from any inconsistencies. It is astonishing that Hawkins, Burney's, and others' views, however abhorrent, for they remain stained with the colonialist blood of slave trading and other Occidentalist exclusivisms, remain in the discourse of modern Greek musicology, In March 2019, a video titled "The Music of Greece: The Influence of Ancient Greece" appeared on the YouTube platform. The text in this video is written and narrated by an eminent professor of Greek. His text has obliterated any trace, not only of any Oriental influence, but also of any Oriental existence at all, as if the world ended with the Aegean Sea, ignoring that the Greeks are certainly more Oriental than they are Occidental, with their focus to the east rather than to the west, as well documented during the Orientalizing period. What is more concerning is that this professor is fully aware of the antecedents of Mesopotamian knowledge on all matters he claims to be conceptually Greek, making the probity of his position academically untenable. In his video, the professor affirms that how incomplete fragments of papyrus and stone provide clues to recreating music that hasn't been heard for thousands of years. However, no dates are given, but the suggestion that these fragments are thousands of years old is misleading, as the papyri mentioned date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE and are therefore under 2000 but not thousands of years old. Nevertheless, there are some older artifacts from the classical period. However, their content does not provide any trace of musical treatises. The oldest document from ancient Greece known to this date is a clay epentron, which is a knee guard used for sewing, with a black figure painting showing a trumpeting Amazon and a few syllables, apparently representing the sounded notes. Altogether, there are only 5 documents dating from the classical period, that is between the 5th and the 4th century BCE. Of the later classical period, only 6 documents have survived, all meager fragments with written music, but nothing about theory. Of the late Hellenistic period, there are 3 written music fragments, and from the Roman period there are about 45 texts with music or with lyrics. Thus, by the time ancient Greece provided its earliest evidence of incomplete musical notation with no evidence of theory, Mesopotamian cultures had fully developed their own systems. The 5 documents which have survived from the Greek classical period, being fragments of music scores, cannot give any information about the formulation of a cogent musical system. Regardless, Hellenist musicologists have produced modern transcriptions such as Euripides' Orestes and Iphigenia in Aulis, and others. However, these transcriptions are said to be a tone lower than the original intonation for Orestes, and a semitone lower for Iphigenia, giving an illusion of perfect accuracy in their transcription. However, this assumption can only be made in relation to relative, and not to absolute pitch, which would be impossible to quantify this far back, without a formal pitch reference, which did not exist at that time, as far as we know, although some argue that the reconstructions of Oloi give absolute pitch. However, the Oloi mentioned are late examples from Egypt, and therefore it is unsecure to base a whole absolute tuning system only on a few late models. Furthermore, the transcription of music fragments has been made from the elements of a theory, which was devised much later from the interpretation of copies, which are unlikely to be relevant to these early texts. Therefore, these notations are posterioristic, as it is impossible to attest that the notation of a melody, written 500 years ago, can be transcribed by means of a theory, devised 500 years later. The musical outcome may sound conclusive to our modern ears, but it cannot authoritatively assure that they are what the original composers had intended when they wrote the melody. Specialists in Greek music have given a list of manuscripts, which would have been copies of Greek treatises, all made during the Common Era. They consist of 1 manuscript from the 11th century, 4 manuscripts from the 12th century, 12 manuscripts from the 13th century, 24 manuscripts from the 14th century, and about 50 manuscripts with uncertain dates. The documents thus collated form the corpus of ancient Greek music and musicology. They show that very little remains prior to before the Common Era. The first scraps of theory come from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the same period, but most documents of theory are copies written during the 14th century of the Common Era. The meager elements of theory extracted from scraps of early papyri would explain their fragile relationship with copies from the Renaissance. However, Hellenists are of the opinion that despite the complexity of their transmission beginning in the 5th century BCE, ancient treatises survived intact, even up to the 14th century CE. That is a span of almost 2,000 years. However, the absence of autographic originals considerably weakens the argument. We find concerning that the originals, from which copies were made, disappeared or were destroyed, and if they were, what would be the reason for the elimination of such precious evidence? It would seem reasonable to assume that once copied, originals would have been kept with the greatest care and would have survived, as have much earlier Egyptian hieroglyphic papyri. When the copy of an original was written and the original destroyed, multiple copies would have been made from the copy of reference. These copies would have been sent to other scriptoria, where they were probably copied again. Centuries later, scholars would attempt at proving the reliability of a copy by comparing it to copies in other libraries, fortuitously unaware that all came from the same source. However, there is another unavoidable dimension, which abrogates the fragile nature of transmission through time. It is the cultural dimension, which preserves the idiosyncratic nature of the music practiced with ethnic groups. For instance, when I was transcribing the Hurrian song H6, I discovered that the music alternated binary and ternary rhythms in specific patterns unknown to the Near and Middle East generally, and at Ugarit, on the west coast of Syria specifically, where the music was composed and sung in the Hurrian language. Now, the Hurrians came, it is contended, from the northeast Caucasus, a region where this particular rhythmic pattern is characteristic. The migration of the Hurrians would have taken 1,000 years before they reached Ugarit, but what is most impressive is the conservation of a particular rhythmic structure that they would have inherited 1,000 years before, and that this particularity subsisted, to this day, in the music of the Caucasus, well over 2,000 years after it had been composed at Ugarit, and about 5,000 years from its original source in the Caucasus. Thus, I would disagree with Horace and claim that scriptura fugit, verba manent, and so the transmission of the earliest Greek music and its theory, after all, would have emerged through the memory of cultural orality rather than via its scriptorial circumvoluted transmissions. However, the question which arises is, was it really Greek music that was transmitted? And so, as Mesopotamia faded away, under the occupation of Seleucus I, Basileus of Syria, and King of Babylonia, Mesopotamian music slowly and seamlessly mutated into Greek music, along with all other arts, cultures, and sciences, during the Orientalizing period. The transition was so insidious that even many centuries later, Greek-speaking Oriental savants, no longer able to read cuneiforms, believed that all they knew came from an incontestably superior Greek knowledge. This confusion lasted until the end of the 19th century, when the cuneiform script was eventually deciphered, and with it the evidence that, for centuries, the world had been led to believe that ancient Greece was the site of all knowledge without contest. In fact, thousands of cuneiform tablets deciphered, as they were excavated from Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Babylon, Nimrud, etc., proved, indubitably, that after all, it was Mesopotamia which was the cradle of civilization and basis for Western culture, and not ancient Greece. This confusion explains why Hellenists to this day still believe in Hellenic supremacy, as for the past millennium, thousands of books have promoted this superiority. Thus, it is understandably difficult for Hellenists to come to terms with one of the greatest historical blunders ever, and it will probably take many more years before Mesopotamians are truly recognized for their legacy to the West, for reasons we shall avoid mentioning in the present document. The earliest attestation of music in Mesopotamia is shown with pre-Sumerian pictograms, dating from around 3,200 years BCE. Additionally, lexical texts mention that at the same period, that is from 3,200 to 2600s, there were a great number of instruments. It is around 2600s that the first tablet giving a list of instruments and their strings was written. This precedes the oldest Greek text by well over 2 millennia. Other literary texts attest of well-established musical ensembles, while the iconography confirms the activity of these groups. During the second millennium, a text with music theory, written in Old Babylonian, that is about 1800s BCE, gives an accurate method for the enneatonic construction of 8 scales, later used by Plato and Neoplatonician Boëthius. These enneatonic scales contain the heptatonic sets, although the construction of a strictly heptatonic system was known only in the middle of the first millennium BCE. During the middle of the second to the middle of the first millennium, a quantity of texts offering various aspects of music theory appeared. Mainly, they complement the elements of musicology of the past centuries. At the same period, Hittite musicology develops, as well as with the Amorites and the Elamites. There are also most interesting texts dealing with craftsmen's instrument workshops, the materials used, the chemicals to process them, the names of these artisans. At the same period, we have evidence of music schools as early as the beginning of the second millennium. At Mari, a school of music for girls gives the names of the students, the instruments they studied, and the name of their teachers. Around 1400 BCE, the Hurrians, having settled at Ugarit in northwest Syria, wrote a series of 29 songs. Only one tablet could be satisfactorily collated. It gives the music and the lyrics. Furthermore, the colophon of the tablet indicates the type of song, the scale in which it should be played, who was the composer, who was the scribe, and who were the dedicatee gods. Some scholars claim that the song was accompanied by a lyre, which is untrue, as there is no mention for such accompaniment. This song is about 1,000 years and a half before the Greeks wrote the song on the epitaph of Seikilos. During the first millennium, around 800 BCE, Mesopotamians wrote the first text of theory for the construction of a descending heptatonic system. Several other texts appeared, adding more information to the theory. Generally, the synthesis for these 2,000 years of musicology is that generally the third millennium was the pentatonic period, the second millennium the enneatonic period, and the first millennium was the heptatonic period. However, there is evidence that the 3 systems were conjointly still in practice during the first millennium. The archaeology of Mesopotamia has produced the oldest string instruments ever found with 5 lyres and harps, unearthed from the Royal Cemetery at Ur. In addition, there were silver pipes, rattles and clappers dating from the same period. The 9th century BCE yielded bronze bells and cymbals from Assyria. To conclude, the evidence that we have produced conclusively proves beyond any reasonable doubt that from the 3rd millennium BCE and by the 5th century BCE, Mesopotamian cultures such as Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, Amorite, Elamite, and others had produced cogent and comprehensive music theories, which later constituted the infrastructure of Western music theory, a comprehensive instrumentarium, the institution of music schools, specialized instrumental workshops, which the Greek inherited during their occupation of the Near East by the Seleucids. Since the Bronze Age, Mesopotamian music knowledge, along with mathematics, geometry, natural sciences, medicine, pharmacy, astronomy, astrology, water management, and other sciences, such as the time system of hours, minutes, and seconds, the 360 degrees of the circle, the approximate value of pi, an approach to trigonometry, tables of reciprocals, giving ratios of pitch quantification of string length, and their reciprocal as ratios of frequency. This formidable amount of knowledge spread throughout the Mediterranean shores, with the Phoenicians, long before the timid budding of a Greek culture. It is therefore preposterous to claim that ancient Greece was a cradle of Western civilization. This was believed prior to the deciphering of the cuneiform script in the middle of the 19th century, and thus it is time that Hellenists abandoned their supremacist claims.